So, the thing I want to know is exactly how are you related to the strike? To my knowledge, you were a striker, but I want to get a feel for which newspaper you worked for and how you were involved with the strike.
All right, I was a reporter at the Free Press, and so I was very much involved in the strike from day one when we walked off the job. I took part in picketing, a lot of different rallies, and I worked for the strike newspaper, the Sunday Journal. When that was started. I did some strike songs at rallies, variety of things. Well, I can't remember all the activities that we took part in, but certainly picketing and at the distribution centers, and on a few occasions out at the Mound Road facility, printing.
Exactly why do you think the strike started?
Well, I don't think there's no question about why the strike started. The companies wanted a strike. They gave each of the unions a final offer that if the union membership had accepted those offers, would have rendered the unions pointless. The one I'm most familiar with, of course, is the Newspaper Guild. It was the union I belonged to. That the company's final offer included language that essentially said that after, it was a 3-year contract, and at the end of those 3 years, all pay raises would be determined by management on the basis of merit. If a union can't negotiate for wages, what's the point of union? And so that's effectively the language that was in their final offer, that we either had to accept or essentially or reject. And if we had accepted it, we'd have been basically killing our union. And they essentially knew that, and they gave the same kind of offer to virtually every one of the unions involved. And so rather than most of us didn't see that we had a whole lot of choice. That we could either accept those offers and go on strike.
How you mentioned some of it, but I want to get an idea of exactly how negotiations were up until that point. Exactly what type of environment were the unions negotiating in at that time?
The details, and I was not a member of the bargaining committee, so I don't know all of the back and forth that happened in negotiations. But in the previous round of negotiations, I think it was like 3 years prior to that, the companies had asked for extensive concessions from the unions, which was part of their effort to make the Detroit Newspaper Agency, the joint operating agreement between the News and the Free Press, to make it work. And as I recall from talking with the members of the bargaining committee, they asked us to accept major concessions in the previous round of negotiations, saying, look, if you accept these this time, we'll be much more generous the next time. Of course, we turn around and 3 years later are confronted with proposals that effectively would have meant the death of our unions, hardly what any of us considered to be generous. The companies at the time were, I mean, as I recall, the agency was turning a profit, but it was not as profitable as they wanted it to be. As I recall, the number that sticks in my head was that the company, the Detroit Newspaper Agency, was making a profit of $1 million a week, about $52 million a year. And that was clearly not in the ballpark of what they considered, reasonable profit. Most businesses, as I understood it at the time, most businesses would have been very happy with a profit margin of 7 or 8%. But the newspaper companies were looking for a profit margin, and I think they were in that, certainly were in that vicinity with that $52 million profit in the year prior to the strike. But they wanted a profit margin in excess of 20%, and were determined to do whatever they could to accomplish that. They also saw the strike in Detroit as an investment. Gannett, which owned dozens of papers all around the country. Knight Ridder did not own generally larger papers, but did not own as many, but they owned papers all over the country. And Gannett in particular very much wanted to eliminate as much pressure from labor as they could. Case in point was the State Journal in Lansing, which was a Gannett paper. 6 months, at the time our strike began, they'd been without a contract for 2 years. 6 months into our strike, they settled for what the company told them to settle for, which was, because they saw what was happening in Detroit. They saw us being out on strike for a long time. And so it was a matter of intimidation. They were trying to intimidate labor. They figured that if they could take on the unions in Detroit, that they could, and win, they would intimidate unions and potential union organizers all over the country. So that's what they wanted, and that's, I guess, what they accomplished.
Earlier you mentioned the joint operating agreement.
Yeah.
I wanted to get a feel for how that affected things.
Well, it affected things because it put Gannett in charge. It was ostensibly a joint operating agreement that was supposedly a partnership between Knight Ridder, which owned the Free Press, and Gannett, which at the time owned the News. But it was structured in such a way that Gannett really ran the show. And they're the ones who had the big, they had the real hardcore attitude toward resistance to organized labor, who had the extreme attitudes toward cost cutting relative to news product, and saw that, and just, so in their policy, Gannett's policies, Gannett's attitudes toward the staff, toward the products they were producing, came to dominate the picture. And so there were those of us at the outset who had thought that that Knight Ridder was a somewhat more enlightened company. I think we were disabused of that notion because it became clear that the folks who were running Knight Ridder were actually fairly willing to go along with you know, let Gannett be the bad guys, but, you know, figured that they could make out by aligning themselves with the tough policies of Gannett.
A lot of what I've heard thus far from other people I've interviewed has been that there were some divisions when it came to other people who had worked at the paper prior and then later returned to work at the paper. I just wanted to see if you got that sense.
Do you have any examples? I mean, I'm not. That doesn't immediately pop out to me. I mean, I don't know if you're talking about management people, because management people moved around more. You know, and that's not ringing a loud bell with me. But maybe if you could mention an example or something, I might think about it.
A lot of the people who I interviewed talked about how certain people had to cross the picket line for various reasons, and how afterwards a lot of people felt that they in some way had betrayed the unions and had.
That's different from what I was conceptualizing from your original question. Yeah, I mean, there were people that within a few weeks started, you know, actually some earlier than that, but certainly within a few weeks, by the end of August, I think the strike began in mid-July, and by the end of August, they were threatening to replace us permanently. And there were people who were giving up and going back at that point. And there were those who well, I mean, it's hard to describe, because there are, you know, I'm not inside of everybody's head, and I know there were varying degrees of resentment among those of us who stayed out on strike toward folks who went back. I never felt a great deal of bitterness toward folks who went back. Disappointment sometimes, but because I saw what the companies were doing. The companies were waging a real intense fear campaign. You know, they were threatening to replace us permanently, and there were people who, you know, I mean, one person I remember in particular who was like an editorial assistant. You know, I had a conversation with, and you know, she realized that job was the best job she was ever going to have, at least in her mind, and that, I mean, she had tried to find temporary work, and it was clear to her that if she lost the job at the Free Press, that she was basically going to be taking a permanent decline in standard of living. She was, you know, responsible for the income for her family. She didn't have, I mean, she had kids. I mean, it was a difficult situation, and I understood that. You know, I knew that I could do something else, and I did. And but I also knew that a lot of folks who chose to go back didn't have that option. And you know, for whatever reason. Now there were a few people, that I'm not fond of as a result of the positions they took during the strike. You know, there were a few that I can think of that one in particular who stands out, who could have written his ticket anywhere and was in a better position than anybody in the news staff to go out on a strike and stay out on a strike. Chose not to. You know, I don't feel bitter toward him, but I don't respect the decision he made. And there was